The tension in the university auditorium was thick enough to cut with a knife. 2,000 students packed into every seat, phones ready, knowing they were about to witness something explosive. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation as hushed conversations and nervous laughter echoed through the massive hall. Security guards positioned themselves strategically throughout the venue, sensing that tonight would be different from the usual political debates. The stage lights blazed down on two men who couldn't be more different. Vivek Ramaswamy in his sharp, tailored suit, a confident fire in his eyes, and Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani, sitting calmly in a simple blazer, hands folded. The contrast was immediate and striking. One man radiating the aggressive energy of a tech CEO, checking his notes one final time and scanning the crowd like an investor sizing up a hostile takeover. The other projecting a serene confidence, seemingly unbothered by the chaos swirling around him. "You think you speak for the children of immigrants?" Vivek's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You're nothing but a puppet for the same socialist failure our parents escaped." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others gasped, but everyone leaned forward. This wasn't going to be a polite political debate. Zohran didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just smiled that knowing smile that would soon become legendary. What happened next would break the internet, trend worldwide for 3 consecutive days, and prove that sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the biggest punch. Vivek thought he was about to destroy Zohran Mamdani on livestream using the same aggressive tactics that had built his media empire and silenced countless opponents before. Instead, he was about to learn why you should never underestimate a man who's fought his way to the state assembly through blood, sweat, and the kind of grassroots organizing that builds real political power from the ground up. Before we dive into this epic showdown, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these incredible political moments that are reshaping America. The stage was set for war, but only one of these men knew how it would end. The university had promoted this event as a dialogue on the future of the American dream. But everyone in attendance understood they were about to witness something far more consequential. This was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of what it meant to be the child of immigrants in America. And the winner would help define that conversation for years to come. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two powerhouses really are. Vivek Ramaswamy strode onto that stage carrying the weight of his anti-woke crusade like a crown. At 39, he'd built himself into one of the most recognizable voices in right-wing politics. A journey that had taken him from biotech entrepreneur to the center of national discourse. From authoring Woke Inc. to becoming a media personality with millions of followers, Vivek had made his career by being the son of immigrants' voice that challenged liberal orthodoxy. His followers hung on every word, seeing him as the truth teller who wasn't afraid to call out what he saw as progressive hypocrisy. He'd spent years building his brand on being fearless and uncompromising. Conservative audiences loved him for it. Liberal critics called him a grifter, but that only seemed to fuel his fire. But tonight, he was facing someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his reputation or deterred by his aggressive tactics. Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani, 33, had taken a very different path to this stage. The son of Indian parents from Uganda, he grew up in Queens watching working-class immigrant families struggle to make rent. That experience had shaped his worldview and fueled his determination to create change from within the system. He became a housing counselor, fighting evictions on the front lines before shocking everyone by running for the state assembly as a democratic socialist. When people said a young socialist from his district couldn't win against the establishment, he proved them wrong. Zohran had earned his seat the hard way, knocking on doors, building tenant unions, and fighting for every vote. Each challenge had only made him stronger, more focused, more dangerous in debates. Where Vivek built his following by being loud and controversial, Zohran had built his power by being smart and strategic. He studied his opponents, understood their weaknesses, and struck with surgical precision when the moment was right. The stakes tonight weren't just about these two men. This was about two completely different paths for immigrant communities in America. Vivek represented the conservative movement's attempt to co-opt the immigrant success story for a narrative of pure capitalism. Zohran represented the new generation of socialist leaders building a multi-racial, working-class coalition. The audience reflected that divide. Young capitalists and conservative students clustered on one side, phones ready to capture clips for social media. Progressive activists and socialists filled the other side, prepared to defend their champion. In the middle sat the undecided, the ones who would determine which man's vision of America would dominate the headlines tomorrow. As the moderator introduced both speakers, you could feel the electricity in the air. This wasn't going to be a debate. It was going to be a battle for the soul of the American dream. Vivek sat forward in his chair, already planning his attack. He'd done his research and was ready to expose what he saw as Zohran's hypocrisy. He thought he knew exactly how this would go. Zohran sat back, calm as still water, watching Vivek's body language, reading the room, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He'd studied Vivek's previous debates, understood his tactics, and had prepared something special for tonight. Neither man knew it yet, but this confrontation would define both their careers and create a moment that would be studied in political science classes for years to come. The moderator asked the first question about economic policy for working-class communities. It seemed harmless enough. It was about to become anything but. The first few minutes seemed almost normal. Both men answered the moderator's questions with their standard talking points. Vivek pushed his message of deregulation and entrepreneurial capitalism, citing statistics on startup growth and the failures of state-run economies. Zohran countered with arguments about systemic barriers and the need for a wealth tax, referencing data on income inequality and the exploitation of gig economy workers. But anyone watching closely could see the real battle brewing. Vivek's voice got a little sharper with each answer, his gestures more animated. Zohran's responses became more pointed, more direct, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. The audience sensed it too. The polite applause carried an edge of anticipation. Then the moderator asked about housing reform, and the gloves came off. The socialist movement has failed working-class communities for a century, Vivek said, his voice rising. They promise a worker's paradise and deliver nothing but more poverty, more scarcity, more broken dreams. Meanwhile, leaders like Assemblyman Mamdani here get famous off their suffering. The conservative side of the audience erupted in cheers. Zohran's supporters booed loudly, but he held up a hand with the quiet authority of a seasoned organizer, signaling them to stay calm and trust his process. That's an interesting perspective from someone who's never held elected office, Zohran replied smoothly. It's easy to criticize from the outside. It's harder to actually do the work. Vivek's eyes flashed. Oh, so now we're playing the credentials game? He shot back, leaning forward. Let me tell you about credentials. I don't need a government paycheck to speak truth to power. I've built businesses and created jobs. That's the difference between us, Assemblyman. You take value, I create it. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Zohran nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right that we're different. I believe in showing up and doing the work, even when it's messy. Some people prefer to throw rocks from their corporate boardrooms. Boardrooms? Vivek's voice cracked like a whip. I've been fighting the victimhood mentality that you sell while you've been collecting checks from the same establishment that wants to turn the American dream into a European nightmare. The phrase European nightmare sent shockwaves through the room. Progressive students gasped. Conservative supporters cheered even louder. The moderator tried to restore order, but the energy was too explosive. Zohran still didn't raise his voice. He waited for the noise to die down, then spoke into the microphone with deadly calm. That's quite a phrase coming from someone whose entire career has been built on telling billionaires exactly what they want to hear about the working class. The progressive side exploded in applause. Vivek's face flushed red. How dare you? He stood up, his chair scraping loudly. How dare you question my authenticity? I've sacrificed a comfortable life to speak the truth while you've been playing the game, collecting your government salary and selling out your community to the highest bidder. The room was in chaos. Students were on their feet shouting. The moderator banged his gavel, but Vivek wasn't done. He pointed directly at Zohran. You want to talk about authenticity? Let's talk about your voting record. Let's talk about how you've done nothing but vote for every tax hike and regulation that kills the small businesses in your own district. You're not a leader, you're a performer. The accusation hung in the air. This was personal now. Zohran remained seated, his hands still folded, watching Vivek's outburst with the calm attention of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. The contrast was striking. One man standing, gesticulating wildly, the other sitting peacefully, completely in control. "Are you finished?" Zohran asked quietly, but his microphone carried every word to the far corners of the auditorium. Vivek was breathing hard, adrenaline pumping. "I'm just getting started. You think because you have a title, because you went to Columbia, because you play the game the way they want you to play it, that makes you legitimate? You're everything that's wrong with the political class in this country." The personal attacks were getting more vicious. Vivek had abandoned any pretense of policy debate and was going straight for character assassination. His supporters loved it. This was the Vivek they'd come to see. But something subtle in Zohran's expression, a slight tightening around his eyes, suggested that Vivek had just made a serious tactical mistake. "You know what?" Vivek continued, pacing now. "I'm tired of people like you hiding behind your academic theories and your government titles while real people suffer. I'm tired of the fake intellectualism, the careful words, the playing it safe while our economy burns." He turned back to face Zohran directly. "You sit there acting so calm and collected, but what have you actually accomplished? What have you actually built for our people besides pretty speeches and cashed government checks?" The moderator had given up trying to control the situation. This was beyond the moderator's pay grade now. Security guards had moved closer to the stage, ready to intervene if things got physical. Vivek was building to his crescendo, the moment he thought would destroy Zohran Mamdani once and for all. "You want to know the truth?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the auditorium walls. "You're everything that's wrong with the modern left. You're a puppet, a fraud, a poverty merchant selling failed dogmas to the very people our parents worked to escape from. You sell them envy and tell them it's justice, all for your elite socialist masters." The words hit like lightning strikes. The entire auditorium fell silent for just a moment, shocked. Then the noise exploded again. Cheers from conservatives who thought Vivek had just delivered a knockout blow. Boos and shouts from progressives who were furious at the attack. In the middle of it all, Zohran Mamdani sat quietly waiting. He had let Vivek exhaust himself, had absorbed every attack, had allowed his opponent to reveal exactly who he really was. Now it was his turn. The auditorium slowly quieted as everyone realized Zohran was about to respond. Vivek stood there breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead, convinced he had just delivered the performance of his career. He had thrown everything he had at the Assemblyman, questioned his authenticity, attacked his record, used the most inflammatory language possible. Zohran looked up at him calmly. "Mr. Ramaswamy, are you finished?" His voice was so quiet that the entire auditorium had to strain to hear, but that only made everyone listen more intently. Vivek, still high on adrenaline, gestured dismissively. "I'm finished exposing you, if that's what you mean." Zohran nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. "I want to thank you, Vivek. You've just given everyone in this room a perfect demonstration of something I've been trying to explain for years." He stood up for the first time, moving with unhurried grace to the center of the stage. The contrast with Vivek's frantic energy was striking. "You've shown us the difference between noise and substance, between performance and leadership, between burning bridges and building them." The progressive side of the audience began to perk up. "You spent the last 10 minutes screaming at me, calling me names, questioning my authenticity, all while proving exactly why your approach fails working people every single day." Zohran's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "You called me a poverty merchant. You said I'm everything wrong with the left. You questioned what I've accomplished." He paused. "Let me tell you what I've accomplished since you asked." And then Zohran Mamdani began to dismantle Vivek Ramaswamy with the precision of a master surgeon. "In my 2 years in the Assembly, I helped pass the strongest tenant protections in a generation, keeping thousands of families in my district from being evicted by predatory landlords. I've written and passed legislation that secured millions in funding for our public transit system and fought to pass a wealth tax on billionaires to fund our schools and hospitals. The progressive side began to applaud, but Zohran raised his hand for silence. I've held over 150 community meetings in my district, not in fancy auditoriums, but in tenant association halls, union basements, and on street corners. I've stood on picket lines with workers from Amazon to Starbucks. I've helped 3 different unions in my district successfully organize for better wages. I've helped over 2,000 families navigate the bureaucracy to get unemployment benefits and housing vouchers. The numbers hit like hammer blows. These were concrete achievements. But you know what I haven't done, Vivek? I haven't spent my career telling billionaires what they want to hear about the working class. I haven't built my brand by tearing down other children of immigrants. I haven't made millions by convincing people that the solution to systemic inequality is to pretend it doesn't exist. The progressive side erupted. Zohran turned to look directly at Vivek, who was standing frozen, clearly not expecting this level of detailed response. You want to talk about authenticity? Zohran pulled out his phone. This is from your social media account last year. Poverty is a mindset. The American dream is available to anyone who rejects victimhood and embraces hard work. That same week, a delivery worker in my district, an immigrant father of 3, died of heat stroke working a 14-hour shift for an app that called him an independent contractor. Was his poverty a mindset, Vivek? Remember his name? The auditorium fell silent. You tell your followers that if people would just stop thinking like victims, inequality would disappear. Tell that to the families in my district who've been priced out of their own neighborhoods by corporate developers. Tell that to the mothers I work with who have to choose between paying rent and buying medicine. Vivek tried to interrupt. That's not what I'm not finished, Zohran said firmly, and the authority in his voice made Vivek step back. You want to know the difference between us? When you see injustice, you blame the victims. When I see injustice, I work to change the system. You profit from telling people their struggles are their own fault. I work to address the root causes of those struggles. He began walking slowly across the stage. To the young people in this audience from working-class families, don't let anyone tell you that your only choices are to be silent or to be loud. Don't let anyone convince you that fighting for justice makes you a victim or a sellout. You can be strong without being cruel. You can be proud without tearing others down. The applause was building, but Zohran raised his voice slightly. Mr. Ramaswamy, you accused me of being a poverty merchant. That's ironic, because the original merchants of poverty were the ones who convinced factory workers and sharecroppers that their suffering was their own fault, that if they just worked harder and complained less, the benevolent hand of the market would save them. The ones who told them unions were the enemy and that the boss's profits would one day trickle down. The historical parallel hit like a thunderbolt. Students gasped, and even some of Vivek's most devoted supporters looked visibly uncomfortable. The comparison was devastating in its accuracy and impossible to dismiss. You've built your entire career on that same message, Zohran continued, his voice resonating with conviction. Telling working people that systemic inequality is our imagination, that poverty is our choice, that if we just bootstrap ourselves hard enough, everything will work out. It's the same lie told by different people for different reasons, but with the same result. Zohran stopped in the center of the stage, facing the entire audience. But here's what you don't understand, and what your billionaire donors don't want you to understand. Real change requires real work. It requires showing up. It requires building coalitions. It requires the kind of patient, persistent effort that doesn't generate viral videos or best-selling books. He turned back to Vivek, who had remained silent during this dismantling, clearly overwhelmed. You called me a puppet. Let me ask you something, Vivek. Who funds your think tanks? Whose talking points are you pushing? Whose agenda benefits when you convince working people to stop fighting for justice? The questions hung in the air like smoke. Vivek opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I'll tell you who benefits, Zohran continued. The same people who benefit from every status quo that's ever exploited our communities. The same people who would rather have one son of immigrants attack another than see both of us working together to tear down the barriers that hold all of us back. The progressive side of the audience was on its feet now, but Zohran was speaking to the whole room. You want to talk about failed dogmas? Let's talk about the fact that your ideological allies opposed every single piece of labor legislation in history. The 40-hour work week, the minimum wage, the right to unionize. Let's talk about how they're trying to ban books that tell the truth about that history of class struggle. He paused. I don't serve on any corporate board, Vivek. I serve the people who elected me. I serve the community that raised me. I serve the future that our children deserve. The auditorium was electric. Zohran had one more shot to fire. You know what the real tragedy is here? You're incredibly talented. You're smart, articulate, passionate. You could be using those gifts to actually help our communities instead of performing for people who see you as their one good model minority. He walked closer to Vivek, his voice becoming almost gentle. But instead, you've chosen to make your living by telling billionaires that inequality is over, that working people just need to try harder, that their pain is their own fault. And when that message gets challenged, when someone like me shows up with receipts and results, you resort to screaming because you don't have facts to back up your talking points. Vivek finally found his voice. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Zohran cut him off. I know that you've never held elected office, but you want to tell those of us who have how to do our jobs. I know that you've never had to fight for funding for your community's public schools, but you want to lecture us about education policy. I know that you've never had to comfort a family facing eviction because they couldn't make rent, but you want to tell us that the housing market is fair. The attacks were precise, personal, devastating. You want to know what I see when I look at you, Vivek? I see someone who's afraid that if you acknowledge systemic inequality exists, you'll lose your billionaire donors. Afraid that if you admit systemic barriers are real, you'll have to do the hard work of fighting them instead of just talking about them. He stopped directly in front of Vivek, looking him in the eye. Most of all, I see someone who's forgotten that our parents didn't survive colonialism, escape poverty, and cross oceans just so their children could get rich by telling the wealthy that the suffering of the working class is their own fault. The auditorium erupted. Students were on their feet, cheering, applauding. Even some of Vivek's supporters looked stunned. Vivek stood there, visibly shaken, clearly unprepared. He had come to this stage expecting to dominate a young socialist with his aggressive style. Instead, he had run into someone who had done his homework, who had facts and receipts, who could match his passion with substance. Vivek started, then stopped. For the first time, he seemed to have nothing to say. Zohran nodded at him almost sympathetically. It's okay, Vivek. When you're ready to have a real conversation about helping our communities instead of performing for your donors, you know where to find me. I'll be at work. The mic drop moment wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, confident, and devastatingly effective. Zohran Mamdani had just shown millions of people how to dismantle a bad faith attack with facts, grace, and surgical precision. He had turned what was supposed to be his destruction into his coronation as a new kind of political leader, one who could be strong without being loud, powerful without being cruel. The auditorium was still buzzing as the event ended. Within minutes, phones were lighting up. Social media was about to explode. Did you see his face when Zohran started listing those housing numbers? One student whispered. I thought Vivek was going to destroy him, another admitted. But damn, the Assemblyman came with receipts. The contrast in how the two men left the stage told the whole story. Vivek hurried off, surrounded by his handlers, avoiding the press. Zohran took his time, shaking hands with students, completely composed. Assemblyman, how did you prepare for Mr. Ramaswamy's attacks? A journalist asked. Zohran smiled. I prepared the same way I prepare for everything, by doing my homework and remembering who I work for. Meanwhile, social media was catching fire. The hashtag #Zohran Receipts started trending within 20 minutes. Video clips of his response were spreading everywhere. The most viral moment wasn't even his strongest attack. It was the quiet way he said, "Are you finished?" before beginning his systematic dismantling. That 8-second clip would be turned into thousands of memes and reaction videos. Conservative Twitter was in damage control mode. Vivek's supporters tried to spin the confrontation, claiming he had been ambushed or that the audience was biased, but they seemed to recognize that something significant had happened. Vivek got fact-checked in real time. One honest conservative commentator tweeted, "That's what happens when performance meets preparation." The progressive side was euphoric. Calm and collected began trending alongside Zohran receipts. Progressive leaders started sharing clips with comments like, "This is how it's done," and "leadership in action." But the most telling reactions came from the middle. People who had watched out of curiosity. "I didn't know who either of these men were before tonight," one viral tweet read. "Now I know which one I'd want representing me." The video numbers were staggering. The full confrontation had been live-streamed to over 300,000 viewers, but within hours, various clips had been viewed millions of times. The "Are you finished?" moment alone hit 2.3 million views on its first day. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, analyzing it as a masterclass in how to respond to bad faith attacks with grace and substance. "What we witnessed tonight wasn't just a debate," one analyst observed. "It was a generational changing of the guard in American progressive politics." The impact extended far beyond social media. Within days, Zohran's assembly office reported a 400% increase in volunteer applications. Small-dollar donations poured in. Most importantly, the specific policies he had mentioned, tenant protections, the wealth tax, public transit funding, suddenly had national attention. 3 days later, a major news network released polling data that shocked political observers. Among voters under 30, Zohran Mamdani's favorable ratings had jumped 25 points. Even more surprising, his favorability among first- and second-generation immigrant voters had increased by 20 points. "He showed that you can be tough without being nasty," one focus group participant explained. "He was strong but not angry, confident but not arrogant. That's what leadership looks like." The long-term implications were even more significant. Conservative media had spent years promoting model minority voices like Vivek Ramaswamy, who validated their audience's beliefs about pure meritocracy in America. The confrontation exposed the weakness of that strategy. When those voices encountered someone with actual legislative experience and concrete achievements, the performance fell apart. For progressive politics, Zohran's response became a template for how to counter personal attacks with policy specifics and stay calm under pressure. The confrontation also highlighted a broader shift. The era of purely performative political theater was giving way to something more substantive. Voters, especially younger voters, were increasingly hungry for leaders who could back up their rhetoric with results. Vivek Ramaswamy tried to recover in the following weeks. He appeared on friendly podcasts and wrote defensive social media posts, but the damage was done. The video of him screaming while Zohran sat calmly had become iconic, a perfect visual metaphor for the difference between noise and leadership. His core argument, that socialism betrays the American dream, had been thoroughly dismantled by Zohran's specific examples of what representation for working people actually looked like. 3 months later, when a major political magazine published its annual Rising Stars issue, Zohran Mamdani was on the cover. The headline read, "The Future of American Leadership." In the interview, he reflected on the confrontation. "I think what that night showed is that the American people are ready for something different," he said. "They're tired of the shouting and the performance. They want leaders who show up, do the work, and deliver results. That's not Republican or Democratic. That's just good leadership." The interviewer asked if he had any regrets. Zohran considered the question. "I regret that we've created a political culture where that kind of confrontation was necessary, but I don't regret standing up for the work we're doing and the people we serve. Someone has to be willing to say that the emperor has no clothes." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though next time, I might not be quite so patient waiting for them to finish their tantrum." The confrontation had indeed changed both men's careers, but in opposite directions. Vivek found his influence waning as more people questioned the substance behind his style. Zohran found himself with a national platform and the credibility to use it, receiving invitations to speak at major universities and policy conferences. But perhaps the most important impact was on the young people who had witnessed the exchange, especially those from working class and immigrant backgrounds. They were learning a new lesson about power. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to tear others down to build yourself up. Sometimes the best answer to noise is substance. Sometimes the way to win isn't to fight fire with fire, but to fight fire with facts. As one young woman posted on social media the day after, Zohran Mamdani just showed me what I want to be when I grow up. Not just successful, but successful with integrity. That might have been the most important victory of all. The story of Vivek Ramaswamy screaming at Zohran Mamdani while the Assemblyman responded with calm authority became more than just a viral moment. It became a symbol of what authentic leadership looks like in the modern age. It proved that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is grace, and the best answer to performance is substance. What do you think? Did Zohran handle this perfectly, or should he have fought fire with fire? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these incredible moments that are reshaping American politics.